Well, it's definitely good to see everybody with us today, and especially good to see the young people on the worship team today. Didn't they do a great job today? The young people and Tim did a wonderful job together. No, it's great. Great to have everybody out there. What a wonderful way to worship together today. I think we're going to be seeing this team together a lot more here in the future, so we're excited for that. I'd like to read for you out of Jeremiah chapter 18, the first two verses. The Lord gave another message to Jeremiah. He said, "Go down to the potter's shop, and I will speak to you there." Now, here's a question for you. If I was to walk into a woodworking shop, how many of you would feel comfortable explaining to me the tools in that shop and how they work? 2 hands? 3? Okay, 4? Okay, so a few of you would feel comfortable explaining the tools and what they do. All right, here's another one. If I was to walk into a sewing room, how many of you would feel comfortable teaching me how to use a sewing machine? Thank you, Greg. All right, we've got several hands. All right, several of you know how to sew. That's good. If I was to walk onto a golf course, who could explain to me the basic mechanics of a swing and the rules? All right, so we got a few hands over here. Okay, all right, there's a few of you. If I wanted to learn how to use a pressure cooker, who could help me with that? All right, so almost half. Very good. I know what you're doing. Now, these are things that you feel comfortable with. These are things that you immediately understand how they work and how you relate to them. And if I were to teach truth, say I would use a pressure cooker to teach about tough, difficult situations, you would understand the idea of building pressure. And if I was, you get the idea, if I was to use each one of these examples, you would connect to it because you understand it. And that's exactly what we see God do with Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 18. God uses something Jeremiah and the entire nation of Israel would connect to as he gets ready to deliver them another message. And he tells Jeremiah, go to the potter's house. Now, pottery was the common material of the day. It was used to make things for common purposes as well as things for decoration. It was things that would be extravagant and things that would be rather simple. So if this conversation was happening with you, God would lead you to a wood shop. God would lead you to a sewing room. God would lead you to a golf course. God would lead you to the place where you can relate and you can understand. And so Jeremiah is led by God to the place where he will understand the message most clearly. God is the God who created us to understand and learn through examples and through pictures. Graham Shaw was the man who inspired the drawings we did together a few weeks ago, if you recall that. And he wrote an entire book on how to communicate in the business world using pictures. And he gave a very interesting study that I never heard before. Back in 1970, there was a man by the name of Ralph Habner who devised experiments to see the ability of the brain to not only recognize but to remember pictures that it had seen. And in one such test, he showed different people a series of 2,560 pictures, and they got to look at one picture every 10 seconds over a series of days for a total of 7 hours. So over the course of about a week, they looked at over 2,500 pictures. 1 hour after the final viewing, he then began to show them 2 pictures at a time. One they had seen during those 2,560. One of them they did not. And they needed to pick which one they'd seen before and which one they did not. And they found out that the people were accurate up to 95% of the time on knowing which pictures they had seen and which they had not. Now here's where it gets crazy. If they only got to see each picture for 1 second, the percentages don't change. Even if they saw one picture for 1 second and they saw over 2,500 different pictures, they could still remember up to 95% of the time what pictures they had seen previously. The concluding comments Graham Shaw makes about this study is, the ability for the brain to remember pictures is almost limitless. The ability for the brain to remember pictures is almost limitless. God uses the picture of the potter to get Jeremiah's attention and to teach him a truth. and the truth still resonates with us today. And there's 4 lessons I want you to take home. Number 1, God is at work. Be patient. God is at work. Be patient. Jeremiah 18:3. So I did as he told me and found the potter working at his wheel. Now, by show of hands, how many of you have ever worked on a potter's wheel before? Okay, so I see about 3 or 4 hands, including me. I'm one who has as well. I'll go into that a little bit later. But if you've never worked at one or don't understand how it operates, we're going to show a short video here. It's about 2.5 minutes long. So you're going to watch a guy make a mug. And he's going to do it. He's an expert. He's going to do it very quickly. But let's watch and see what goes on in this particular video.
What I'm going to show you today is how to make a straight beaker that looks a little bit like that. Okay, over here. Right, I've got 14 ounces of clay in that bowl. I'm going to throw it onto the wheel. Turn the wheel on. Bear with me. The wheel's now on. Centre her up. Using my fingertip rather than my knuckles because I'm kind of looking at the shape more as I'm coming up. Pull up number 4. Take the water out of the inside of the sponge. Take some of the water off the outside. Hold the sponge on the rim to smooth it off a little bit. And then I take the secret tool, which is like a credit card, cut down. I take it to the bottom, and then I slowly come up. And I'm going to put a mark on about there. And then just bring the lip out a little bit more like that. And that is a straight mug. Let's put that on the others. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
How many of you think you could do that? Okay, not one person raised their hand. Nobody's that arrogant. That's good. That's good. So I asked for a show of hands. So I think about 3 people besides myself raised their hands that they had worked at a potter's wheel before. Well, when I was in high school, I took a pottery class. Now, there's one reason I took a pottery class. I wanted an easy class that I didn't have to do any homework for. And you just can't take pottery home. And so I thought, this is easy. I got it made. It turned out I actually enjoyed the class. And I actually took it seriously. And I got to sit at the potter's wheel, and I made a bowl. And it actually looked like a bowl. I couldn't believe it. And it ended up being a change bowl that we would put change into for years until it fell out of the windowsill into the sink and shattered into a million pieces. But it was good while it lasted. But what I noticed, and especially with my classmates, is working at a potter's wheel, he made that look easy. If we had all day, we would be lucky to maybe produce a mug of that ability, of that quality, and even then it would be unlikely. It takes a lot of time. It doesn't take 2 minutes like we just saw for the average person. Working a major project takes a long time on a potter's wheel. And when something takes a lot of time, it requires a lot of patience. Our lives are a lot like that pottery. It takes a lot of time to form and mold and move, and we got to have a lot of patience as God works with us. We need to remember God is at work, and it is our job to be patient. Let's imagine, play a little game of pretend. You walk into a pottery shop, and you notice a beautiful teacup. It's a beautiful teacup. You've never seen anything quite like it. You pick it up and say, wow, this cup is beautiful. I've never seen such mastery before. And then suddenly the teacup begins to speak to you. And the teacup says, well, you don't understand. I've never been this beautiful until most recently. There was a time I was just a lump of clay. And you say, really? And so now you're having a conversation with the teacup. You're not crazy. It's actually happening. And you say, well, what happened? And the teacup says, well, let me explain it to you. My master took me and began to roll me out and crush me together. And I said, hey, that hurts. Leave me alone. And he just simply smiled at me and said, not yet. And then he put me on this wheel. And I was spun around in a circle really, really fast. I said, hey, stop it. I'm getting dizzy. And the master just smiled at me again and said, oh, not yet. And then he put me in an oven. Oh, I've never felt so much heat in my life. I didn't understand why he wanted to burn me. Why did he want to hurt me? I was just a lump of clay. And I banged on the door and said, let me out. And he simply mouthed, and I could read his lips, and he said, not yet. Well, finally he took me out of the oven, and I began to cool off, and I was so grateful. But just as I thought it was all over, he began to paint me with this liquid, and the fumes were terrible. I was about ready to gag, and I said, stop it. This stinks. And my master simply said, oh, not yet. And then he put me back in the oven. But this wasn't like the first oven. This was twice as hot as the other oven. And I pleaded, I screamed, I begged to get out of that oven. But my master just simply watched at me and mouthed, not yet. Oh, I knew there was no hope, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. I knew it was all over. I was going to disintegrate in the heat. When all of a sudden, he opened the door, and he took me out, and he put me on a shelf. 1 hour later, he handed me a mirror, and this is what I saw. Wow, I'm beautiful. And then my master spoke to me, and he said, I want you to remember, it hurt when I rolled you out and patted you. But I left you alone, you would have dried up and been unusable. I know it made you dizzy when I spun you around on the wheel, but if I had stopped, you would have crumbled and you wouldn't have been strong. I knew it hurt and it was uncomfortable and very disagreeable in that oven, but if I didn't put you in there, you would have cracked. And I know those fumes smelled bad, but if I didn't brush you with them, with that paint, you wouldn't have hardened. And I know that second oven was even worse, and it was a lot harder, but if I didn't put you in there, then the hardness wouldn't have held. You would have broken. But now you are a finished product. You are what I had in mind when I first began. God knows what he is doing. And if we could see the end of God's work, we would say, okay, whatever it takes to get from here to there, it's worth it. We don't have that kind of vision. We know heaven awaits and that perfection is there, but until we get there, we don't know what it takes to get there. We don't know what kind of wheel we're going to be put on, what kind of oven we're going to be baked in, but here's what we know. The end result is worth it. God is at work in our lives, and we need to patiently wait for him to continue to work and mold and form our lives. God has a piece of pottery in mind for our lives. He has a good, pleasing, and perfect will that is good for all of us, and we just need to trust him. It's so easy to look at our circumstances and our difficulties and our problems right now and wonder, what is God doing? Just remember, God is at work. We need to be patient. He takes a lump of clay and he can turn it into something beautiful. He can take our lives and make it something meaningful, purposeful in his time. So while God is at work, let's be patient. Secondly, I want you to know that our lives are in God's hands. We need to be submissive. Jeremiah 18. Then the Lord gave me this message. Oh, Israel, can I not do to you as this potter has done to this clay? As the clay is in the potter's hand, so you are in my hand. Our lives are in God's hands. He's the master potter. We need to trust him, and we need to be submissive to his work and his ability. It's always good when you have someone who knows what they're doing. Like Henry Ford. Charles Steinmetz had one of the greatest minds in the field of electricity in Henry Ford's day. He knew more about electrical engineering and how machines worked than anybody else. Steins actually built the generators that would move the assembly line, which was in Dearborn, Michigan, in Henry Ford's first plant. The assembly line worked like clockwork. As the Model A came across the line, then the next Model T came across the line, which could come in any color as long as it was black. That's right, as long as it was black. And that Model T had a massive 20 horsepower engine. The assembly line hummed and profits poured into the factory, and Henry Ford was becoming quite the wealthy man at this particular point. But then one day, the assembly line came to a halt. The work stopped. The lights went out. Mechanics tried unsuccessfully to locate the problem, but they couldn't do it. So Henry Ford was losing money. He was getting frustrated, so he contacted Steinmetz. And Steinmetz arrived at Ford's plant, pushed a few buttons, turned a few switches, turned off the master power, turned it back on, it fired back up and kept working like it had never missed a beat. A few days later, Henry Ford received Steinmetz's bill, and it was for $10,000. Now, this was the early 1900s, keep in mind, so that was a bit excessive. Now, Ford was a rich man, and he had no problem affording the bill, but he just thought it was a little steep. So he called Steinmetz up and offered his concern about it. So Steinmetz rewrote the bill, and he sent it to Henry Ford. And the bill said this: for tinkering around the motors, I charge you $10. For knowing where to tinker, I charge you $9,990. Henry Ford paid the bill. In the Christian life, maybe we need to think of God as that master tinkerer. God has made us. God knows what we're made of. God knows where to work in our lives when we need something done. And our lives, they need some tweaking and turning from time to time. They need some effort. They need some redirection. And we think we know where it needs to be. But God is the master. And we need to trust at His hands what needs to be done. The difference between fixing a clay bowl on a potter's wheel and our life, though, comes down to one word, and that's willingness. The clay has no willingness or opinion. It just exists and does what is done with it, and if it's left to rot and it's hardened, and then it does. But our lives are in God's hands, and we need to be responsive to the true potter. We need to be submissive to His will. We need to trust that He knows what He's doing. Kind of a side note, on Friday, I was here working in the office, and our cleaning lady came in, and she said, just so you know, my boss was here, and she smelled gas in your furnace room. And I thought, well, that's not good. And so I went in there, and I don't have the best sense of smell in the world. I'm like, I'll just take your word for it. I'm going to call the Clean Gas. They found that we had at least 2 different leaks of gas in our furnace room. And I trusted them to handle it all. They capped off the lines. They set everything up. Because if we can fix it, you won't have heat on Sunday morning. The heat is on. We're good to go. I trusted the experts who knew what they were doing. And then Kenny came in, and Eric, and they replaced the water heater that was leaking gas as well yesterday. So we appreciate that. And finally, everything's up and running the way it should. But I knew there was a problem, and I'm going to trust the guy who knows what he's doing. I'm going to trust the Clean Gas. This is their expertise. Well, guess what? We have expertise for our lives, and it's God, and we need to trust Him and be submissive to His leadership and His lordship. Now, something else to keep in mind, and this is kind of another side note, but I think it's important. A potter never makes a bowl, at least a practical bowl, and the bowl itself is the blessing. It's what the bowl can hold, or what the bowl can do that make it useful. It can hold soup, it can hold cereal, it can hold something and be practical and be good. And so a lot of times it's the contents which are more appreciated than the bowl itself. And sometimes that's how we need to look at our lives. We don't need to make our lives this thing where it's all the attention on us, but it's He who dwells in us that gets the attention. It's He who dwells in us that gets the glory and the honor. Inside the Christian, we're told, is the Holy Spirit. What is inside of us makes us special, unique, and saved. God says we are in His hands, so we better be submissive. James chapter 4, verse 7 says, submit yourselves to God. That's exactly what we need to do. He is the potter, we are the clay. Third, our mistakes are not eternal. We can be remade. Our mistakes are not eternal. We can be remade. Jeremiah 18:4. But the jar he was making didn't turn out as he had hoped. So he crushed it into a lump of clay again and started over. As I worked at a potter's wheel in high school, I found out that if you don't have the clay perfectly centered, it's going to be lopsided and it's not going to work out right. Or even if you get it centered and you dig your fingernail in just a little too much on one side, it puts a cut line in it. And then you got to crush it down and start over again. And I messed up that clay bowl 100 times, but I finally got it figured out by the end of the class. And the messed up clay bowl is not the end of the day. It just takes some effort to begin again. Or sometimes you start working on something and you think, that doesn't really work like that. I'm going to make it into something else. And I think that's how God works in our lives. One more example from pottery class here. So as I was working in pottery class one day, we had to make a stationary object. And I don't know why, but I decided I would make a toaster. I don't know. I just decided I'm going to make a toaster. And so I made the toaster, and it was coming together quite nicely. It looked just like a toaster as far as I was concerned. My teacher came over and said, Mark, That is the nicest bill holder I have ever seen. So I was actually working on the cord right then so I just threw the cord away and I took the button off that made it a toaster and turned it into a bill holder. And so I just repurposed it. And sometimes the mistakes in our lives are just like that. We make mistakes and we think we're disqualified from God's service. We make too many mistakes and we think, that's it, God doesn't want to use me anymore. We think we've crossed one too many lines. But understand, our mistakes aren't eternal. We can be remade. Maybe we were intended to be a toaster and God's going to turn us into a bill holder, but it's still going to be for His purpose, His glory, and His honor. Yes, our mistakes might cause us to go in a different direction than we wanted to originally, but we still can be useful and productive. Our mistakes are not eternal. We can be remade. All we've got to do is look at the Bible and we see how God remakes people again and again. God says, give me a murderer like Moses, and I'll turn him into a great leader. And it was when he was 80 years old that he was called to lead the people of Israel. God said, give me a deceiver like Jacob, and I'll make him the father of my nation. And you think of Jacob, he deceived his brother. He deceived his father. He ran away. He deceived his father-in-law. Yet God used him to establish the nation of Israel. God says, give me a dreamer like Joseph, and I'll turn him into a co-commander of Egypt. Now, Joseph didn't make any obvious mistake that would have caused his difficulty, but it was other people's mistakes that affected him. And God took him from being a slave and a prisoner to being the second in command over all of Egypt. God says, give me a captive like Daniel, and I'll turn him into a prayer warrior. Taken from his homeland at 18 yeyears old, didn't go home till he was probably 80 years old. He was a prisoner for his whole life. Yet he became a prayer warrior that began to pray in a public way and challenged his enemies as a result. God says, give me a shepherd boy like David, and I'll turn him into a king. David was a simple boy, the last of several brothers. Yet God would call him to be the greatest king. And he would become he would murder, he would adultery, he would look to get revenge on his enemies. But God would still use this shepherd's boy to become a king. God says, give me a child like Jeremiah, and he'll become a great prophet. And he's still preaching to us some 3,000 years later. God said, give me a fisherman like Peter, and I'll turn him into an apostle. Now remember Peter, he would deny Christ 3 times. He on the very night when Jesus needed him the most. I mean, you talk about someone who failed, it was him. And God used him to preach the first sermon in Acts chapter 2, and 3,000 people were baptized in one day. God said, give me a persecutor like Paul, and I'll turn him into a preacher. Paul was determined to destroy the church, determined to destroy Christianity as we know it, and instead he became the most well-traveled preacher and author the church has ever known. God says, give me someone who's been married 5 times and living with a 6th person she's not even married to, and I'll turn her into an evangelist. And that's what he did with the woman at the well. God says, give me you, and you will be my witnesses throughout all of the world. That's what God can do with our lives. Our mistakes do not disqualify us from God's service. We can be remade. It may be something new and different, and that's okay. We're not beyond God's reach as long as we're breathing. There is no human who is merely a replica or a repeat of another. We're all uniquely and wonderfully made, regardless of our mistakes. So let's rise up above them and let the Master Potter direct and build our lives. Fourth and finally this morning, our future is in God's hands. We need to be intentional. Our future is in God's hands. We need to be intentional. Jeremiah 18. If I announce that a certain nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, and destroyed, but then the nation renounces its evil ways, I will not destroy it as I had planned. And if I announce that I will plant and build up a certain nation or kingdom, but then the nation turns to evil and refuses to obey me, I will not bless it as I said I would. After a bowl is ruined on a potter's wheel, there's an option when the potter begins again. He can try to make the bowl again, or he can make a new project with the clay. Or it could be possible he just gets frustrated with the clay and throws it out. In chapter 19, the very next chapter after this one, Jeremiah is called to take the elders of the people and the elders of the priests out into a field. And they follow out there, and he takes this clay bowl that the potter had made, and he lifts it up, and he smashes it on the ground. And he lets them know, your actions today will impact your future and what God has planned for you. Therefore, Jeremiah warns them to live intentionally. Our future is in the hands of God. We need to be intentional. God has planned out wonderful things for every person in the world. But sometimes we are so intentionally living away from God that a different result happens in our lives. We need to be intentional with what God has given us. Every day is a gift. I believe it. I hope you do too, and I hope you live intentionally. It goes back to that age-old question, if today was your last day on earth, how would you live it differently? Would you confess hidden sins that you thought you could get away with, or that you thought you would deal with eventually? Would you decide to follow through on accepting God's offer of forgiveness of your sins? Would you be baptized? Would you heal a relationship with someone who is angry at you? Would you finally get around to sharing the faith with that family member or friend who needed to hear it for so long? If so, then maybe Jesus is calling us to do today what we would do if we thought it was our last. Because, as we know, this very well could be. It's not a scare tactic. This isn't, ooh, turn or burn. No. This is a reality check. This is get serious. Our lives are too precious to be so flippant. We need to be intentional. I think so many people walk through their lives so lazily, and they're not intentional about anything that matters. Our future is in God's hands. We need to live for Christ now and every day by being intentional. What's going to make the difference in our lives? It's the touch of the Master's hand that makes all the difference. There was an 80-year-old violinist who lost his wife to cancer, and his family had to put up the house for auction. It hadn't been maintained in some time, and things were starting to deteriorate. They had to get rid of stuff, and his health wasn't very good, so he was going to be moving to assisted living for the remainder of his days. And so they lived on a farm, and all the farm equipment sold quickly, and they got through that, and the furniture sold easily. But then it came time for the violinist's own violin to be sold. Now, this was an old violin, and it was one his father had made for him, and it was dusty, and it didn't look very well, and the auctioneer just began, "Can I get $50? No one raised their hand. Someone said, "Can I get $40? No one raised their hand. 30, 20, 10, 5, anything. Will anybody give anything for this violin? Well, the 80-year-old man just couldn't take it anymore. He walked forward, and he picked up the violin, and he blew the dust off the strings, and he wiped it down, tuned it very briefly, and then he began to play. Everyone was there overwhelmed. They gave him a standing ovation at how well the man played this dusty old violin. And the auctioneer returned and said, "Can I get $100 for this violin?" And the hand went up. "Can I get $200? A hand went up. 3, 4, 5, 1,000, 2,000. The bidding war had begun. People were excited to get this violin. It wasn't because the violin was so special. It's because of what the master could do with the violin. Well, as the worship team joins me on stage, I want you to understand that our life is like that old violin covered in dust. Without the hand of the master, it's really not worth much. But in the hands of the master, we truly become priceless. Here's the message I want you to take home today. We all have made thousands of mistakes, and if we have a significant time left on earth, we're going to make thousands of more. You can't count how many times you've messed up, and neither can I. But here's what the story of the Potter's house means for us. You may need to be reworked, but you will never be discarded. So many people are so callous to the lives of people. They say things, they deserve to die. I wish they weren't born. I don't wish that of anybody. Our lives are too precious in the hands of the living God. And this story teaches us our lives will never be discarded by God. We'll never be discarded. God loves us too much to throw us out. This morning, if you need to make a decision to accept the love of the great Potter, and you need to have your life remade and reworked, I want you to meet me down front as we stand.